So the paper that I prepared for this occasion, as it turns out, would actually be too long to read. So what I'm going to do, or attempt to do, is to describe some of its major points and then read some bits. I don't usually do that, and I don't really usually like it when people do that. Usually I find when people say, oh, I have a paper here, but I'm going to just talk through the paper, they end up taking more time to say less. But I'll do the best I can. Basically what I want to do in this paper or talk is to elucidate what it is that Kant has to contribute to an understanding of the concept of imagination as it's relevant to the case of aesthetics, but to suggest that it's missing a few important elements that we can find in some other 18th century authors. In particular, we'll say something about Adam Smith and Moses Mendelssohn. And my suggestion is that if we add what they have to say to what Kant has to say, we could get a richer conception of the imagination and its potential for aesthetics than what Kant himself has to suggest. Now, Kant, of course, is famous for pushing the idea of the free play between imagination and understanding as the core notion of aesthetic theory. I think of this as essentially a proposal for a psychological explanation of aesthetic pleasure. How exactly we should understand aesthetic pleasure and Kant's conception of aesthetic pleasure is another story. Actually, lately I've been coming to an interpretation that is not too remote from the conception of pleasure as engagement that Mohan Matan was presenting yesterday. But I'll leave that aside. My overall conception is that Kant identifies the free play of imagination and understanding as the central feature of aesthetic experience and the explanation of aesthetic pleasure by considering what he takes to be the simplest kind of case of aesthetic experience first, what he calls the experience of free beauty, primarily of nature, and that then, having identified that, he treats it as essentially a necessary condition of aesthetic experience, which can, however, figure in more complex cases as well. And for the most part, the case that we generally tend to be interested in, the case of fine art, actually is a more complex case than the case that Kant begins with for analytical purposes. I mean, there are various reasons why Kant sometimes suggests that the experience of the free beauty of nature is actually more valuable than the experience of beauty in the case of fine art. But I think his reasons for arguing that are quite specific, and they don't amount to general theory. Okay, so Kant then, as I say, pins a great deal on the conception of the free play of imagination and understanding. He's not completely original in introducing the idea of, or using the idea of play to characterize aesthetic experience. We can find passing references to play as a characteristic, or maybe even a defining characteristic of aesthetic experience in Mendelssohn, in Lessing, in their compatriot Johann Georg Sulzer, who wrote a gigantic general theory of the fine arts in the 1770s that became a 4-volume encyclopedia by the 1790s. But Kant is certainly innovative in the way in which he foregrounds this notion and in the way in which he characterizes free play as free play between the imagination and understanding. But the question is exactly what Kant, what all of this means. What he means by imagination and what he means by its relationship to understanding. Much of the time, Kant only offers us metaphors, I think. The idea of play itself is perhaps a metaphor here. I mean, we know what it is for children to play a game. We know what it is for players to put on a play. But to transfer that into the realm of psychological, whether we accept Kant's dressing up of that as transcendental psychology, or whether we insist, as I tend to do, that it's really more like armchair empirical psychology, that's a metaphorical extension of a notion that has its home elsewhere, and it would be nice to be able to unpack the metaphor. So among the metaphors that Kant uses is one of the mutual enlivening or animation, Belebung is the German word, of these two faculties, the mutual animation of them to harmony and so on and so forth. But you know, that's another metaphor. At any rate, he doesn't do a heck of a lot to actually stop and define or analyze what he means by imagination, what he means by its free relationship to the understanding. So we have to hunt around in his text for some illumination on the subject. One passage that, since I began to work on this subject many years ago, I have found helpful is a paragraph in the first draft of the introduction to the critique of the power of judgment. The critique of power of judgment, of course, is the third of Kant's critiques. Its first half is the critique of the power of aesthetic judgment. That's where Kant formally presents his aesthetic theory. He wrote the bulk of this in 1789 and published it at the beginning of 1790. Early in 1789, he drafted an introduction to the whole, which, however, in the end, he didn't use, according to his correspondence, mostly because it had gotten too long. That, I think, is not entirely accurate. It doesn't fully reflect certain of the themes that became important to him in the course of writing the work. It was subsequently published, and it, as I say, has one illuminating paragraph in which he suggests that what this condition, this mental condition is one in which the subjective conditions of cognition are satisfied without the normal objective condition or conditions of cognition being satisfied, which I interpret to mean that it's one in which it feels to us, it's a mental state in which it feels to us as if the overall aim of cognition, namely the unification of the manifold or the multiplicity of our experience, has been achieved without the normal condition under which that is achieved, namely the subsumption of the manifold under a concept. The concept unifies a manifold of experience in a very straightforward way. The concept of a triangle tells us that these three intersecting lines that we observe belong together insofar as they constitute a triangle. The concept of a dog tells us that these various odors and furry feels and yapping sounds that we may be experiencing belong together. They constitute the experience of a single object because they satisfy the various predicates that are required for the application of the concept dog. So ordinarily, a concept, the application of a concept is what unifies or completes the unification of the manifold of experience. Manifold of experience is a fancy Kantian phrase, but it just means something like, you know, a bunch of different incoming data, like a certain smell and a certain sound and so on. But in the aesthetic case, the suggestion is that somehow we have a sense that the imagination on its own has satisfied our underlying or overarching cognitive aim of unification, and we take pleasure in that fact. A particularly noticeable pleasure, as he says in the published version of the introduction, precisely because something that we, in some sense, want is happening under slightly surprising circumstances in the absence of what usually guarantees it. But that still leaves wide open the question, I mean, that may tell us something about what he means by the harmony between imagination and understanding, but it still doesn't tell us all that much about what he means by imagination itself. Now, there's only one place that I know about where Kant actually proffers a definition of the imagination, and this is in the text of the second edition version of the Transcendental Deduction, where he says that imagination is the faculty for representing an object even without its presence in intuition. It's the faculty for having a representation of an object in the absence of the actual presence of that object. That's a totally conventional definition of imagination at the time. That's at B151 in the Critique of Pure Reason for anyone who wants to look it up. That's a completely conventional definition of the imagination. We find the same definition pretty much in Baumgarten's Metaphysics, which is Kant's textbook for his lectures and the source of much of the structure of Kant's own philosophizing. We think of Kant as a radical innovator, but his innovation in many areas of philosophy takes the form of pouring slightly new wine into old bottles. The outward structure is often taken over from these predecessor philosophers. Okay, so imagination is the power to have a representation of an object without the actual current presence of that object. In Baumgarten and in Kant, this can take at least two forms. It can take the form of essentially recollection, having now a representation of an object that is not currently present to one, but that has been present to one at some point, and the previous presence of which presumably explains one's ability now to have a representation of it. But it can also take the form of what Baumgarten called pre-vision, or maybe more simply foresight, that is, having a representation of an object that one has not yet actually experienced. So memory on the one hand, anticipation on the other hand, those are both forms of imagination in this way of thinking about imagination. And obviously, of course, you can see how this, the second of those in particular, or the combination of the first and the second of those, can lead to another fairly traditional conception of the imagination, namely as the ability to put together various representations that one has obtained from actual experience of objects or experience of actual objects in the past, to put them together in ways that one has not actually encountered in the past, and that perhaps one could not actually encounter because there is no such combination out there in nature. So, standard illustration of that, and this conception of imagination certainly you find in Hobbes and Locke, as well as in these German writers. The idea of a unicorn, it's a complex idea composed of ideas derived from experience of horses, and from experience of goats with the little beard that the unicorn actually has, and from the experience of narwhals, which have a single horn, actually in the case of a narwhal, exaggerated tooth that seems to come out of the front of their head, and recombine these. There are no unicorns in nature to the best of anybody's knowledge. Certainly the idea of unicorn was formed by people without any actual experience of unicorns, but it was formed simply by putting together representations that had been derived from actual objects in some combination that hadn't been derived from actual objects. Totally standard notion of imagination. Okay, so that's fine. Kant has various reasons for introducing that into his, what he calls the subjective side of the deduction, or the sort of transcendental psychology, the general conception of cognitive processing, because all knowledge involves recollection of various moments that have been experienced, and then the combination of them. Imagination is essential in that way. But I think we have to say here that representations have many possible dimensions or aspects to them. And there's a question of whether imagination, in its recollection and eventual recombination of representations, is somehow especially linked with particular aspects of representation. Now, as a matter of fact, in his, at least in his initial exposition of his account of aesthetic response, as I call it, aesthetic experience, in the Analytic of the Beautiful, the first part of the Critique of the Power of Aesthetic Judgment, which is not yet Kant's theory of our experience of the fine arts or of the creation of fine art, Kant tends to focus on spatial and or temporal form. Pattern. He famously says in section 14 that, of the Analytic of the Beautiful, that in painting it is the drawing that is essential rather than the color or coloration, which can heighten, add charm to the geometrical form that is the essence of the drawing, but isn't the basis of aesthetic experience. Straight out of Alberti on that. He says likewise that in music, in the case of music, it is the composition, i.e. that which sort of is represented by the patterns in a score that is essential, and what we often call, again, the coloration, what comes from the particular instrumentation and the timbres and overtones of the particular instruments, that's not essential. That can add charm, but it's not essential. So, I mean, this is, of course, it's on the basis of this passage, which is, well, which makes reference to specific fine arts, that Kant has often been enlisted in the cause of formalism. So the idea would be that, okay, spatial and or temporal pattern is an essential feature of representation, and we can have, in virtue of the imagination, representations of spatial and temporal pattern in the absence of an object currently inducing such representations of pattern in us. And then presumably we could also recombine patterns, invent patterns, form patterns that we haven't actually experienced, that have not actually been presented to us. This would be pleasurable. Either the creation of such patterns or the experience of such patterns would be pleasurable insofar as these patterns give us a sense of unity or coherence without the application of any concept to them. And we have, then we would have a certain explanation of aesthetic experience and of the role of the imagination in it. That imagination would be the ability to create pleasing spatial and temporal patterns, essentially. Problem with Kant's inference here, or his restriction of the subject matter of the imagination to spatial and or temporal form, is that his own notion of form is more abstract than that and is not actually restricted in that way. So when he gives a general definition of form, which he does, as best as I know, once, in the prefatory material in the Transcendental Aesthetic of the Critique of Pure Reason, this is at A20B34, or I could be off by one page, his definition of form is that which allows a manifold to be related. So any kind of relationship that we can detect in a manifold of experience or intuitions in his term, and that allows us, either with a concept or without the benefit of a concept, to experience that as coherent, experience that as some form of unity, actually would satisfy his general definition of form, and it needn't be just spatio-temporal patterns by his own definition of form. So relations among colors that we somehow find coherent and harmonious, as in some of Joseph Alber's homages to the square, or in a Rothko painting, for example, those ought to count. And any other kind of relationship among items of experience that somehow allows us to have a sense of that experience as unified, coherent, etc., ought to count by Kant's own definition. Now, Kant never explicitly says that. But I think, in fact, as he continues the critique of the power of aesthetic judgment, he is actually exploiting that. Because what he really does is, over the course of the whole text, including the exposition of his account of the creation and experience of the fine arts, which should have, according to Kant's correspondence, been titled as a separate section of the book, but because of errors in production never was, and just seems to be a continuation of the analytic of the sublime, in spite of Kant's allegation that the experience of the sublime is produced by nature and not by fine art. What he does is essentially give us an increasingly broader range of materials for the imagination and kinds of combinations that the imagination may form. So I'll just quickly enumerate those and then turn to what I think is left out of his conception of the imagination and what Smith and Mendelssohn, as I mentioned, have to add to it. So he starts again. So the first case is from which he begins, the simple case of free beauty, primarily of nature, but also in certain figures in certain cases of art, some forms of decorative art. He refers to foliage and borders, patterns on wallpaper, and music without words, in which his thought is we are just responding to spatio-temporal patterns. So that's the first case. The imagination can create new patterns for us and can create patterns that we find coherent without the use of a concept. We take pleasure in that. That's the simplest case. But that's not the only case. The second case is what he calls the experience of adherent rather than free beauty. That's my translation of the German word anhängende. It was also called dependent beauty in older translations. And this is a case in which we have an experience of beauty in the, or we experience the pleasure of beauty in experiencing an object, although we do recognize a concept of the purpose or intended function of that object. And at least as Kant initially presents it, we take the concept of the intended purpose of the object to constrain possible forms for that object. So we take the purpose of the object to be, so to speak, a necessary condition on the form of the object, but not a sufficient condition, and not something that is sufficient to block our taking pleasure in contra-purposive forms of the object, but not by itself sufficient to explain our pleasure in the object. So that I always he gives a list of examples. He refers to a church, an arsenal, a summer house, and then some other kinds of more complicated examples. And the idea is Of course, the intended function of a church places certain constraints on what forms it may take. Let's take the case of a cathedral church and certain rites. It has to have a cruciform floor plan. If it doesn't have a cruciform floor plan, basically that's going to annoy us and block taking pleasure in its form, whatever else the form might be. But if it has a cruciform floor plan, of course, that by itself is not enough to guarantee that we're going to find it beautiful. It's just a necessary condition on finding it beautiful. An arsenal, like the gates of the Arsenale in Venice or something like that. Well, if it's an arsenal, we have certain expectations. It has to have thick walls. The walls have to be high enough to keep, attackers from just jumping right over them. The openings have to be minimal, enough for people to shoot out, perhaps, but small enough to make it hard for people to shoot in, and so on and so forth. And if the thing is presented to us as an arsenal, then these expectations that are raised by its intended function can block our finding it beautiful if they fail to be met. But once again, meeting them does not by itself suffice to make us find the object beautiful, just a necessary condition. Now, that's kind of where Kant begins, but some of his examples hint in a slightly different direction. We can certainly expand the notion. There are certain cases in which we find a harmonious relationship between the formal features of the object and its intended purpose, where, however, the concept of the intended purpose does not dictate that the form be that way. So, just a simple, quick illustration. Let's take a cathedral church that has a cruciform floor plan, and where the form of the crucifix is reflected in various other ways in the design of the church, like, say, the quatrefoils of the clerestory, where the requirements of being a cathedral don't dictate that, but nevertheless we get a sense of harmony between let's say, the visual form or the visual appearance more generally, maybe throw in now the materials that are used and so on. We get a sense of harmony between the form of the object and its intended purpose, which is not dictated by the concept of the intended purpose. That would, I take it, be another case of the imagination at work. The third kind of case that Kant considers is the case in which the imagination suggests an ideal form for objects of a certain kind. So the concept is going to be involved because we're talking about warriors or cows or whatever. I pick these examples because his two examples, well, actually not a warrior, an athlete, the Doryphorus of Polykleitos and Myron's cow, two famous sculptures of antiquity. And his suggestion is that here the imagination creates an ideal form, a form that we think is somehow, expresses the essence of a discus thrower or a cow, but where that's not, however, derived in any straightforward way from the concept of from the concept of a discus thrower or the concept of a cow. Nevertheless, there's something about that form that seems especially suitable. It's not derived also by any straightforward process of averaging. It's not derived by a Galtonian process of, taking images of as many cows as you have ever experienced, or as many athletes as you have ever experienced, and somehow overlapping them all in your mind's eye and then seeing where the darkest part of the image is, the sort of place where there's the most convergence, and taking that as the norm. No. Most cows fail to meet the ideal form of Myron's cow. Most human beings, and certainly even many athletes, fail to meet the ideal that we somehow form. So if we were just averaging, we wouldn't get the ideal, but we have an ideal, and somehow that's got to be due to the imagination. That's the last case, and perhaps the most important case, is the case of the fine arts. And here, in his famous theory of aesthetic ideas, in which he totally undercuts his initial suggestion that content is not crucial to our experience of fine arts. What Kant is describing is essentially a case in which there is harmony between the form, or more generally, all the relevant aspects of the art object as an object in some medium, a painting, a drawing, a musical composition, whatever. There's harmony between that and some grand idea. In his view, typically a grand idea from morality, which is the content. The form, however, of the object, taking form in its most general sense, is not dictated by the concept of the content. It's not as if there's some straightforward right way in which to illustrate the theme of, let's say, overwhelming arrogance and pride that leads to the fall of Satan, which is the subject matter of Paradise Lost. A million different ways to illustrate such an idea in a work of art, and of course Milton came upon, or at least in Kant's view, came upon a particularly wonderful way of doing that, a way that's especially suitable and so on, but is not dictated by the concept of the content. That's an act of imagination on his part. Okay, so all these things are acts of imagination because they're all creations of form, although in the most general sense of form, where something like the relationship between colors in an albert can also count as form, and not just this the pattern of nested squares, where the various incidents that comprise the content of Paradise Lost, as well as the sound of the speech itself, and the rhythm and the rhyme, and etc., all that can count as form. Somehow the imagination creates a form for a content. We find that form unified, coherent, satisfying, even though there's no concept that requires just that form. That's Kant's basic idea. Okay, two things I think that he leaves out, but that others add, and they both in a way have to do with representation. So, of course, well, it wouldn't do to say that all 18th century theorists just take it for granted that all art is representational, right? Because Kant starts off with actually with the case of art that's not representational, music without words. Nevertheless, when it comes to painting and literature and sort of paradigmatic cases, music has a funny status for Kant. The assumption is that, generally speaking, art is representational, and there are special features of representation which Kant doesn't spend much time talking about. One of them is brought out by, and I'll just try and do this in 5 minutes and leave a couple more, some time for discussion. So you don't think of Adam Smith as an aesthetician. I mean, Smith is famous for 2 works on moral sentiments and on the wealth of nations, but among the papers that he left behind and told his, as many famous people did, told his executors to burn, which however they did not burn, is a paper called On the Nature of That Imitation which takes place in what are called the imitative arts. And that was published shortly after his death. And the central idea here is that our pleasure in artistic representations, or what he calls imitations, comes not simply from resemblance between an imitation and its object, but rather from the fact that the artist has succeeded in creating, you might say resemblance, probably better say reference, succeeded in creating representation by wresting it out of a medium which does not resemble its intended object. For example, by creating a convincing, moving representation of 3-dimensional human figures out of pigment on a 2-dimensional canvas, or out of a 2-dimensional array of pigment. Or by creating a representation of living, alluring human flesh out of cold, white marble, and so on. Smith says that though a production of art seldom derives any merit from its resemblance to another object of the same kind, it frequently derives a great deal from its resemblance to an object of a different kind. A painted cloth, the work of some laborious Dutch artist, so curiously shaded and colored as to represent the pile and softness of a woolen one, might derive some merit from its resemblance even to the sorry carpet which now lies before me. But the real thing is here, the real thing is that in this such case, in painting a plane surface of one kind is made to resemble not only a plane surface of another, but all three dimensions of a solid surface. And in statuary and sculpture, a solid substance of one kind is made to resemble a solid substance of another kind. So there's an act of imagination involved on the part of artist and on the part of audience in seeing something representing something which is essentially different in kind from it. We might try and reduce this to admiration of artistry, admiration of the skill of the artist in bringing about almost an illusion by means of his manipulation of medium. But I don't think that's all. That's something that Mendelssohn includes in his account of our experience of the fine arts, although it's just one aspect of it. I don't think that's the main thing that Smith has in mind. I think Smith has in mind is that there's simply a kind of cognitive thrill in seeing a medium of one kind represent something of a different kind. That's an unusual cognitive act that we just enjoy. We might even think here of something like Richard Wollheim's notion of twofoldness, that it's not just a fact that we can see an object of one kind in a physical object of a very different kind, but that's something that we enjoy. And we enjoy the exercise of our own imagination in experiencing in that, and don't just admire the exercise of the imagination of the artist who produced that. So I think that's one interesting idea that Smith could be seen as adding to Kant's theory. Of course, Smith didn't know Kant's theory since he died before it came out. Mendelssohn adds another point about the disparity between the media of artistic representation and the objects of such representation, namely that this disparity can create aesthetic distance, a gap sort of between fact and fiction within which the imagination can operate. And here I think he makes an important point about imagination that neither Kant nor Smith make precisely. He's got a complex theory of the complexity of our aesthetic responses. He has a whole account of what he calls the mixed emotions. But the main contribution here, and let me just finish up with this one page, is that we experience a genuine emotional response to the representation of characters and events that we know to be fictional. This is a feat of imagination in the formal sense of response to an object that is not currently and literally present to us. We respond to the jealousy of Othello, or the grief of Othello once he realizes what an idiotic thing he's done, without there being any person who's actually jealous or grief-stricken in front of us, right? There's an actor, but the actor presumably is not actually grief-stricken. Mendelssohn differs from Kant, of course, in wholesale in the fact that he emphasizes our emotional response to art, which is a feature that Kant tries to suppress as hard as he can. But it's sort of interesting the way in which he explains how we can have emotional response. Genuine emotions He says sympathetic fear, not artificial fear or quasi-fear or anything like that, in response to persons and events that we know to be false or fictional or at least long dead. Basically, Mendelssohn's answer is that our minds are complex, that we can keep our knowledge that what we are reading or seeing is a fiction separate from our emotional response to the events, and that artistic media, features of artistic media, help us do that. Mendelssohn observes that we have to be at the right distance, metaphorically or literally, to keep our responses to the representation and to what is represented from collapsing into each other. He says if the object gets too close to us, the pleasant character of the representation completely disappears because the relation between subject and object collapse, as it were, into one another. But also, not just distance in terms of feet, but the distance created by the disparity between medium and object of the kind that Smith noted, actually some years later, allows us, sort of creates the space, the distance in which the imagination can operate. So he says, Mendelssohn says, the difference between the material of the imitation and the material of nature, the marble and the canvas, are the most obvious sensed features which, without damaging the art, call the attention back from the illusion whenever necessary. But one can also argue that the medium, let's subsume it under the description of proscenium arch, doesn't just bring us back to the illusion, to the illusionary character of what is represented, but it's what allows us to keep our knowledge that we are being presented with a fiction separate from our emotional response to the fiction. We know that Othello or King Lear is a fiction, and we don't have to forget that, but the separation between the stage and ourselves that's created by the arch or by parallel features in other media is enough to satisfy our epistemic scruples and to allow us to indulge and enjoy our emotional response to the depicted figures and their fictional joys and sorrows. And so what I'm suggesting is simply that the imagination needs a certain kind of space in which to, it needs a certain separation from our strictly cognitive functions in order to allow our emotional responses to objects to flourish. And so this is a subtler notion or an addendum to Kant's idea that aesthetic experience takes place without a concept. Its aesthetic experience takes place in a sphere that is liberated from certain cognitive assumptions more generally, and that is either a feat of the imagination or crucial for the operation of the imagination. Okay, I'm sorry I've gone on too long, but let me stop now and we'll have time for some questions.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to suggest 2 points that might suggest free play might not be a metaphor, and I'd like to hear what you think about it.
Okay.
First point is the role of sensation in imagination. And if you look at one section in Baumgarten's Metaphysica, he said it distinguishes between imagination and sensation, and sensation is a hindrance to imagination. And it suggests that sensation is the hindrance to freedom in imagination. That is, and if you have that in view, the free play between imagination and understanding suggests that understanding is something that guarantees freedom in imagination for Kant.
That the understanding guarantees it?
Understanding instead of sensation.
Okay.
That's the first point. And the second point is relates to the third point in your active imagination. And that I understand that your point refers to creation of archetype.
Yeah, right.
In your abstract.
Right.
And I was thinking of Baumgarten's notion of the original archetype, which is God.
Yeah.
And creation of archetype is Kant's origin, it seems to me. And so, and that again, there is some guarantee of freedom in creation of archetype. So I'd like to hear.
Right. The second point seems kind of dubious to me. I mean, there are, of course, places in which Kant talks about the divine understanding as archetypical rather than ectypical, meaning that the divine understanding creates its own objects, whereas our kind of understanding merely copies objects. But this comes in very different context from the aesthetic. I don't think that Kant particularly has that in mind here. As for the first point, I guess I find that a little puzzling. In particular, you're suggesting that he might take over from Baumgarten the idea that the understanding can guarantee freedom of the imagination by liberating the imagination from sensation. So I find that hard to reconcile with Kant's idea that the aesthetic experience is free from dependence upon concepts. He seems to be explicitly abjuring a role for concepts of the understanding rather than falling back upon one. Now that whole subject itself has to be interpreted with some care because it doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't even make any sense for Kant to assume that our aesthetic experience takes place in complete independence from all concepts. Can't be, because according to the critique of pure reason, all our experience involves concepts. And when you just think about it, aesthetic experience is an experience which we take to be an experience of a rose, or of a mollusk, or of a play, or of a string quartet. So it can't be that our experience, that our mind is, so to speak, completely blank of all concepts. That's crazy. That's incompatible with Kant's epistemology as well as with our own assumptions. So it must be that the concepts that are involved, that are obviously applicable to an aesthetic object, are not sufficient to produce the full unity and coherence that we experience. There are various ways in which the unity of our experience goes beyond what's dictated by concepts. But in any case, concepts can't guarantee the freedom of the imagination. Concepts are themselves a threat to the freedom of the imagination, I think, in Kant's view. So, on the other hand, certainly you're right that in Kant's view, aesthetic experience is not an immediate response to sensation as such. That's the experience of the agreeable, not the beautiful. Some chocolate, and you get certain sensations, and you get pleasure without the mediation of any further cognitive activity. So aesthetic experience, I think, on the one hand, in some sense, has to steer its way between mere constraint by mere sensations and constraint by mere concepts. So he can't be taking that idea directly over from Baumgarten. Right.
This isn't working.
Oh, okay.
So
I think I'm loud enough anyway. That was
not
well. That was really interesting. This is just. It's not really a question. It's more just like a call for clarification. So, in the fine art case, I'm interested in this idea of the harmony between the form and its content. And did you say there? I'm interested in the whole idea of aesthetic ideas. So, was the content there an aesthetic idea? Because aesthetic idea seems like a little version of that, because it itself is a presentation of imagination which the understanding can't.
Yeah.
Kant says, you
Right.
can't give you can't give words to it. I mean,
Right.
you try, but you
Right.
So it seems like it has an endlessness in itself, which seems to also be true of the harmony that you're talking about. I mean,
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
Wondering if there are two two levels of the same thing.
Right.
Whether you've got some sort of something imaginative and the impossibility of giving a concept to it, or no matter how much you say, you never adequate to the
Right.
thing here. So
Right.
I'm just wondering how that works. It sort of seems complicated because there's two
Yeah.
layers.
Yeah. So I think basically the aesthetic idea, well, I'll say one qualification to this, but first let me just agree outright. The aesthetic idea essentially is the harmony or free play between form in its most general sense and the content. The content, on Kant's view, is a rational idea. And the aesthetic idea is a pendant to the rational idea. So
That's a moral idea.
that's a moral idea in his
Right.
view, and take, the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of hell, pride, greed, whatever. That's, in the most general sense, the content, and that's a rational idea. And then the aesthetic idea is the non-rule governed way in which it is presented. Now, that involves the presentation, of course, depending upon what the medium is, involves many aspects or even sort of many layers. So
the notion of aesthetic idea already includes the notion of the form that is in harmony with that. Oh, I see.
Right.
I see. Okay.
at least that's the way I understand it, yeah.
Okay.
Probably
Thank you.
stop there.
That's good.
And I'll take one more quick question.
Oh, great, yeah, I'll try and keep it really brief. Yeah, thanks very much for that, it was really interesting. But I wanted to ask you about your discussion of form
Mm-hmm.
and just the distinction between thinking of kind of pure form as you put it, spatio and temporal patterns, but then a more general idea of form that could all include other kinds of relations like colours, for example, in painting. It seemed to me that Kant makes that distinction in order to distinguish between kind of the pure a priori understanding of aesthetic responses as contrasted with a more kind of empirical response, if you like. So I just wondered if you're arguing that he shouldn't make that distinction or can't make that distinction because the two are so intertwined in our experience.
Right.
Outlook.
Well, they are intertwined, but I'm not, and there are certain ways in which he admits they're intertwined, in which he says the color adds charm to the form and so on. But I'm not making, so to speak, a phenomenological point. Rather, I think that Kant, what lies behind my comments there is the thought that Kant is really being driven by two competing forces. On the one hand, he's got his commitment to the idea that aesthetic judgments must have universal subjective validity. So they must be based on something that can be guaranteed to be common to all normal human observers. And then he makes the assumption that, in fact, all humans agree in their response to the basic structures of experience, spatial and temporal patterns, but that there's much more variation in their response to colors. So he wants to push them to the side. But that's one pole of his thought, and the other pole of his thought is really the idea of free play. And in a sense, we ought to keep an open mind as to what can enter into a free play. Once we have the characterization of free play, however exactly it's to be understood, as involving form in the most general sense of form, whatever it is that allows us to relate things to each other, then we ought to, so to speak, keep our minds open empirically as to what could actually play that role. And so the idea here is then ultimately that we might think of the desideratum of universal subjective validity as an analytical tool, which leads us to the idea of free play. But then once we get to the idea of free play, we have to let it take us where it will. And we might also, perhaps in the end, think of the idea of universal subjective validity as a kind of regulative ideal. We wish to be able to communicate with each other. We wish to establish community with each other. We can do that to some extent on the basis of shared appreciation of works of art, as well as, of course, many other things. So for that reason, we have a certain ground to prefer works that are more widely accessible rather than less, but that's not an absolute. And anyway.
Okay, that's really helpful.
There were actually a number of other questions that people would have liked to ask. I'm afraid we've run out of time, Paul, but I hope you get the opportunity to ask them, answer them or talk to people in the next break. So could you please join me in thanking